So today we're going to talk about what is possibly the single greatest invention humans have ever come up with. We are talking about something that has saved more lives than we could ever really imagine, ever really picture, and has changed society for the better in ways that it's tough to not get hyperbolic about. So let's get into it. So what's the point? By the end of this, you should be able to explain what a vaccination is. You should be able to describe the impact that the vaccination programs have had, and I couldn't even do that at the beginning, so good luck. We want to differentiate between the methods for acquiring an active and a passive immunity, and that'll make sense in the table at the end. And we want to understand why willful rejection of vaccination programs for non-medical reasons is dangerous to both individuals and society at large. Okay, so uh, basically, vaccinations they allow for artificial immunity to be acquired. And this is called immunization. Now, you're going to need to remember what the terms antibodies are. Okay, now remember that's the chemicals that bind, the proteins that bind to antigens that our body makes. Um, so they can be used against both bacterial and viral infections. Fantastic. That's most of the things which causes problems. Um, Children throughout the world they're routinely vaccinated against many diseases. Um, they're expensive on a small scale, but mass immunization programs are not only super effective, they're super cost effective. Um, Unfortunately, immunity is not always lifelong, and the presence of antibodies can dwindle. And for this, we have um, the the booster injections. And here we see, I think this is uh, hepatitis B. So you get your first injection, and you come back here, and 40 weeks later, you have your next injection, and that shoots it through the roof. So it starts up. It's all right. You're protected for a little while, but then boom, and that protects you for a longer time. But after a while, that eventually also dwindles. All right. So they are the most effective method of preventing a disease available to modern science. And we're not talking about little diseases. We're talking about diseases that vaccines have been so effective that people forget that these are insanely dangerous diseases. We'll talk about measles in a minute. And measles, a lot of people think of measles as a childhood disease, but it kills 1 in 1,000 people who get it. And a large number of people who do have it have long term um, effects for the rest of their life. All right, so many diseases that were so deadly in the past either wiped out completely or extremely rare until recently. Um, so let's look at measles. This is cool. Here's measles. It's affecting thousands of people in the US. And then we get vaccinations, and then boom, 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 almost nothing. Unfortunately, if we get this graph goes into about 2010, it starts to shoot back up again, and that's a bad thing. Polio, so we see polio here. We've got the first polio vaccination, and drops. There was a little scare here. Like, they had a problem with the vaccine, and it went back up. And then they got a different version of the polio vaccine, and polio it's almost gone, and that's amazing. Okay, so we're going to do types of immunity and how we get them. Okay, so passive. Passive immunity is when you are given antibodies. Okay, now if you feel the need to write this down before we talk, pause, then let me go on. Otherwise, let me talk and then pause and write it down. Okay, so passive, you're given antibodies. So there's natural, which comes from a mother's milk. Okay, that's a passive type of immunity. The babies they have no immune system, so through breastfeeding they gain um, their mother's antibodies. So they tend to be immune to whatever the mother's immune to. Then we have antibodies are extracted from another organism and injected into the person needing them. Um, these are short term, very short term, or useful after an exposure. For example, if we look at rabies, tetanus, snake bites, diphtheria, I don't know, so I can't really tell you that. But I know these three, they're all administered after you're bitten, or after you've stepped on the rusty nail, or after the Cujo's chewed on your throat for a little while. So then we have active, which you produce your own antibodies, and this is a much longer lasting type of immune system, type of uh, immunity. So, uh, produced as a result of infection. So you get infected, your body produces its own antibodies, you're then immune to it. That's natural. I mean, that's what happens. That's rhinoviruses like cold. Hopefully, I'm now immune to this strain of the cold that I have right now. Influenza, blah blah blah. As we go on, so you can be you can be exposed to harmless versions of the diseases. Now, these are what we call attenuated, which means weakened. These ones down here, sorry, that's vaccine. This is vaccine. Okay, so you get a harmless version of the pathogens, and you can then, and that allows you to build antibodies which are specific to both the harmless version and the virulent version. This is polio as well. Unfortunately, polio had they had issues with this at the start off with, and that was in the very early days of vaccines, and we're well beyond that now. So you can be exposed to dead pathogens, which will still have the antigens on the outside of their cells. Okay, a booster is required for this one, and this is pertussis, which is whooping cough, influenza. All right, so you can be exposed to pieces of the virus, which means that just sections of it. Now you see that these two here are both infinitely safer than this one here. So if you're exposed to pieces of the virus, such as human papillomavirus, which all girls get now, hepatitis B, which you'll get if you go to, say, Southeast Asia, like the vaccination, hopefully not the disease, you're exposed to a piece of the virus. And again, it stimulates your body to produce your own antibodies in the B lymphocytes that will be specific to that disease. All right, so resistance. Being wrong about vaccines. I'm not going to soft pedal this. There's a right stance and there's a wrong anti-science stance. Before I go on, some people are unable to take vaccines for medical reasons. This is not who I'm talking about. Okay, so basically, you can consider this a social responsibility. People who are unable to have vaccines, they don't have the immune system to protect themselves against these deadly viruses. In particular, newborn babies, they can't get their first vaccination till at least after 4 weeks, and it's preferable to wait a couple of weeks longer than that. Most people are protected from some of these diseases by what we call herd immunity, which is enough people are vaccinated and the disease can't latch on in the community. It doesn't get a chance to take off because every time it moves from one person to the other, it can't get in there and spread and it just dies. If herd immunity is insufficient, though, that puts people's lives at risk because they made bad choices, and their choices are going to endanger the lives of babies, the lives of, again, elderly people who can't be vaccinated. Now, for example, if you're allergic to eggs, you can't get a job in abattoirs in this country because you can't get a Q fever vaccine, which means you're not allowed to work in an abattoir. So, if you're allergic to eggs, some vaccinations are unavailable to you. Now, the herd immunity protects all of us. It protects, but in particular, it protects babies. In Australia right now, I think in the last, we'll say, 14 years, approximately 20 babies have had severe whooping cough infections that have resulted in permanent damage or death. Okay, so basically there was a former doctor, and let me just highlight former doctor, Andrew Wakefield, who he conducted a very poor and unethical research that linked vaccinations to autism. And unfortunately, this scared a lot of parents. There is no link. It, no link at all. Okay, like there's so much research has been done and no link's been found. Um, there was also lies spread about the chemicals in vaccines. Now, these are things like formaldehyde, mercury, which the important thing to remember about a poison is the dose. Like, if you don't have a high enough dose, the poisons, all poisons tend to be safe, and all of the really safe chemicals that you drink, like water, have enough of that, and they're poisonous. Now, again, I would like to clear up, not all anti-vaccination campaigns, in fact, most of them, they're not liars or bad people. Mostly they're misinformed parents who feel they're doing important work. Unfortunately, um, they're often vulnerable parents who have been preyed upon by certain individuals. Um, and often it comes down to a general distrust of both science and pharmaceutical corporations. And often this is linked to a new age lifestyle, etc., blah, blah, blah. But these are people whose work is conducted through peer research, like peer-reviewed research. Like it's public, it's out there. Uh, Vaccinations are important, and they save more lives than we could ever imagine. All right, consequences. Basically, this anti-science, anti-evidence, and anti-reality stance on vaccinations is costing lives. Um, the highest profile victim of pertussis or whooping cough in Australia was a 4-week-old girl called Dana McCaffrey, and she was born in an area with very, very low levels of vaccinations, and unfortunately she caught whooping cough and she died. And it's a really tragic event. The reason she wasn't vaccinated is she was too young. And on babies this young, whooping cough is extremely fatal. Oh, not extremely. It has a high fatality rate though. Since the very late 1990s, nearly 20 babies in Australia have died of pertussis infections that were preventable. Measles is also highly fatal, as we said earlier. 1 in 1,000 people will die from measles. A lot of people see this as a harmless childhood disease, and if you get it as a child, it's not as bad. But when you get it as an adult, and particularly as a young adult, that's when its fatality rate is at its highest. But it's extremely preventable. Since vaccination rates have dropped significantly, it's started to appear throughout I guess what we'd call the developed world. And here we see it in this little animation you've seen before. So if you look at the red bumps alone, we see as time goes on, measles increases. And that's because of these anti-vaccination groups that are spreading that's dangerous. Whooping cough, we also see, again, particularly in Australia, it starts to appear, and in Europe and America. And so forth. So that's us. I hope you found that interesting. And yeah, we'll continue next lesson with I think our last lecture in the series.